In the darkness of night, under a canopy of stars that served as her only map, a woman moved through the forests and swamps of the American South. She carried no weapon but a small pistol tucked into her clothing. She had no army but the courage burning in her heart like an eternal flame. She had no grand title bestowed by governments or institutions, but she had one given to her by the people she saved, a name spoken with reverence and awe: Moses. Her name was Harriet Tubman, and she was the most wanted woman in America. Born into the brutal machinery of slavery, a system designed to crush the human spirit and reduce people to property, she escaped to freedom. But freedom, she discovered, was not something you could enjoy while others remained in chains. Not when your family still suffered. Not when your people, millions of them, were bought and sold like livestock. Not when children were torn from their mother's arms and sold to the highest bidder. So she went back, into the darkness, into the danger, into the very heart of the system that had tried to destroy her. Again, and again, and again. 13 times by most accounts, though some say it was more. 13 times she returned to the land of her enslavement, walking into the lion's den with nothing but her wits, her faith, and her unbreakable will. She guided over 70 souls along the Underground Railroad, that secret network of safe houses and brave souls who risked everything to help the enslaved reach freedom. And in all those journeys, through all that danger, across all those miles, she never once lost a passenger. Think about that for a moment. Not once. Slave owners put a bounty on her head. Some sources say it reached $40,000, an astronomical sum in that era. Enough to buy a plantation, enough to set a man up for life. Wanted posters with descriptions of her circulated throughout Maryland and beyond. Slave catchers, brutal men who made their living hunting human beings, searched for her relentlessly. But they never caught her. Not once. She moved like a ghost through the southern night, appearing when needed, vanishing when pursued, always one step ahead of those who sought to capture her. This is not just a story of escape, though her escape alone would be worthy of remembrance. This is not simply a tale of survival, though her survival against overwhelming odds is remarkable. This is a story of defiance, of a woman who looked at the most brutal, most entrenched, most powerful institution in America and said, "No, this will not stand, not while I draw breath." This is a story of someone who refused to accept the world as it was and fought with every fiber of her being to make it what it should be. Of someone who risked everything she had gained, not once, but repeatedly, because she believed that freedom was worth dying for, and more importantly, worth living for. This is the story of Harriet Tubman, a slave who became a liberator, a fugitive who became a legend, a woman who became a force of nature that even the institution of slavery with all its violence and power could not contain. Before we begin Harriet's extraordinary journey, if you believe stories of courage and resistance need to be told, if you believe history's heroes must be remembered, help us share Harriet's story by subscribing to our channel and turning on notifications. Every subscription helps us honor these incredible lives. Now let's begin.
Harriet Tubman was born Araminta Ross, called Minty by her family, around 1822 on a plantation in Dorchester County, Maryland, on the eastern shore of the Chesapeake Bay. We say around because the exact date of her birth is unknown. This was not an oversight or a clerical error, it was by design. The births of enslaved people were not recorded in official documents. Their lives were not considered worthy of documentation. They were property, and property didn't have birthdays, didn't have celebrations, didn't have histories worth remembering. This erasure of identity began at birth and continued throughout the lives of enslaved people. They could be bought, sold, traded, or inherited like furniture or livestock. Their families could be separated on a whim. Their bodies were not their own. Even their names could be changed by their owners. But despite this systematic attempt to erase their humanity, enslaved people held on to what they could. They remembered. They told stories. They kept their histories alive in the oral traditions passed from generation to generation. And Minty's story, though it began in bondage, would become one that could never be erased. Minty was born into a world that told her, from her first breath, that she was less than human, that she was worth only what a slave owner would pay for her at auction, that her body, her labor, her children, if she ever had any, her very existence belonged to someone else. The law said she was property. The church said it was God's will. Society said it was the natural order of things. But there was something in Minty that refused to believe it, a spark that could not be extinguished. Her mother, Harriet, or Rit Green, and her father, Ben Ross, were both enslaved on plantations in the same area, which was a rare mercy in a system that routinely tore families apart without a second thought. Rit and Ben had managed to stay together, and they had at least 9 children, though the exact number is uncertain because some of their children were sold away before Minty was old enough to know them. Think about that horror for a moment. Imagine holding your child, nursing them, watching them take their first steps, hearing their first words. And then one day a white man comes to your cabin and takes that child away. You will never see them again. You don't know where they're going. You don't know if they'll be treated well or brutally. You don't know if they'll survive. And there is nothing you can do. No court will hear your plea. No law will protect you. Your screams and tears mean nothing to the system that allows this. This happened to Rit multiple times. Her daughters were sold away. Minty grew up knowing that at any moment, she too could be torn from her family and sold to a stranger. The plantation where Minty was born belonged to Edward Brodus, though the family that owned her mother, the Pattisons, technically still had claims on Rit and her children under complicated inheritance arrangements. This legal complexity didn't matter to young Minty. What mattered was that she was enslaved, and her life was not her own. From the age of 5 or 6, Minty was put to work. She was too young and small for the brutal labor of the fields, so she was hired out to other families in the area. This was common practice. Slave owners would rent out their enslaved people to others, collecting payment for their labor, while the enslaved person endured whatever conditions and treatment the temporary master imposed.
Minty was sent to work for a woman named Miss Susan, who needed help with household chores. Her job was to wind yarn for weaving, and later to check muskrat traps in the nearby streams. To check those traps, this child, barefoot, inadequately clothed against the cold, had to wade through icy water in the early morning darkness. She was 6 years old. Most 6-year-olds today are learning to read and playing with friends. Minty was working in freezing water before dawn, her small hands numb with cold, knowing that if she came back empty-handed or if she made any mistake, she would be beaten. And she was beaten, often and brutally. When she made mistakes, as any child would, she was whipped. When she was sick with measles and still forced to work, she was whipped for working too slowly. Once, when she took a single lump of sugar because she was desperately hungry, Miss Susan chased her with a whip. Minty ran. She ran and kept running, and she hid for 5 days in a pig pen, sleeping among the hogs, fighting them for potato peelings and vegetable scraps from the slop. She was terrified to go back because she knew the beating that awaited her would be severe. But eventually, hunger and cold forced her to return. She was 6 years old. Let that sink in. 6 years old, hiding in a pig pen, fighting pigs for food because she was so terrified of being beaten that even that seemed preferable. When Minty was about 7, she was hired out to another couple who wanted her to care for their baby. They placed her in charge of keeping the infant quiet. Her job was to rock the cradle constantly, all night long, every night, to keep the baby from crying. If the baby cried and woke the mistress, Minty was whipped. Imagine being a child yourself,
exhausted beyond measure, fighting to keep your eyes open through the long, dark hours of the night, knowing that if you dozed off for even a moment, if you let that cradle stop rocking, you would be beaten. She developed a technique of rocking the cradle with one hand while she dozed, sitting up, jerking awake whenever she felt herself slipping too deeply into sleep. She bore the scars of those whippings for the rest of her life, scars on her back, on her neck, on her arms, physical reminders of a childhood stolen by slavery. But physical scars, as terrible as they were not the deepest wounds slavery inflicted. The psychological trauma, the constant fear, the knowledge that your life had no value to those who controlled it, these were wounds that never fully healed. When Minty was about 12 or 13 years old, an event occurred that would fundamentally change the course of her life. She was at a dry goods store, perhaps running an errand for her owner, when an enslaved man ran into the store, trying to escape from an overseer who was chasing him. The overseer was furious. He was determined to punish this man for the crime of trying to escape his bondage. He demanded that everyone in the store help him restrain the fleeing man. He ordered Minty to help. She refused. This was an act of extraordinary courage. A young girl, herself enslaved, with no power, no protection, no rights, refusing a direct order from a white overseer. She knew what could happen to her. She had been beaten for far less. But something in her said, no. She would not help capture another human being seeking freedom.
The enslaved man broke away and ran out the door. The overseer, enraged, grabbed a 2-pound iron weight from the store counter, a heavy piece of metal used to weigh goods, and threw it after him. His aim was poor, or perhaps in that moment, fate intervened. The weight missed the fleeing man and struck Minty directly in the forehead. She collapsed. Blood poured from the wound. Her skull was fractured, the bone cracked, her brain injured. She lay there, bleeding and unconscious, and those present thought she might die. Her owner, Edward Brodess, was furious when he learned what happened, not because his enslaved child had been grievously injured, but because she was now damaged property. He tried to sell her while she was still recovering, advertising, "A slave woman who is not worth a cent because of her injury." Potential buyers looked at this girl with blood still seeping through the bandage on her head and walked away. No one wanted to buy damaged goods. When it became clear she wouldn't sell, Brodess sent her back to the fields to work, even though she had not healed. She was made to labor with blood and infection still weeping from the wound in her forehead. The injury was so severe that pieces of her skull had been driven into her brain. But Minty survived. Her body, pushed beyond what should be endurable, somehow endured. However, the injury left her with a permanent condition that would affect her for the rest of her life. She began experiencing sudden episodes where she would fall into a deep sleep without any warning, sometimes in the middle of a conversation, sometimes while walking, sometimes while eating. These sleeping spells, likely a form of narcolepsy or seizure disorder caused by the traumatic brain injury, could last from a few minutes to a few hours. There was no predicting when they would occur or how long they would last. To the slave owners and others who judged human beings only by their economic value, this condition made Minty defective. She was damaged goods, unreliable labor, worth less at auction. They saw her sleeping spells as a flaw that reduced her value. But something else happened because of that injury, something the slave owners could not understand and could not value. Minty began to have vivid dreams and visions. She would see herself flying like a bird over fields and rivers, escaping bondage, soaring over the landscape below. She would see paths through forests she had never walked. She would dream of freedom so real and so vivid that she could taste it, could feel it in her bones. Some people, then and now, have suggested these were hallucinations caused by her brain injury. Others have said they were the result of her sleeping disorder, vivid dreams bleeding into her waking consciousness. Minty believed they were messages from God, divine visions sent to guide her. The truth may be all of these things, or none of them. What matters is that these visions gave her something precious: hope. In the darkest moments of her enslavement, when the cruelty seemed endless and escape seemed impossible, she had these visions that told her freedom was real, that there was a path out of bondage, that she was meant for something more than a life in chains. And one day, those visions would guide her through the darkness to freedom, and then they would guide dozens of others along the same path.
As Minty grew from a girl into a young woman, she grew stronger. The sleeping spells continued, but between them she was remarkably strong and capable. She was eventually put to work in the fields doing the same backbreaking labor as the men, plowing, hauling timber, cutting wood. She could match any man in strength and endurance, and she developed a pride in her physical capabilities. She also learned skills that would later save her life and the lives of others. She learned the woods, every trail and creek and hiding spot. She learned to read the night sky, to navigate by the North Star. She learned which plants were edible and which were poisonous. She learned to move silently through the forest, to sense when danger was near. All of these skills, learned during her years of bondage, would later become the tools of her liberation. During this time, Minty also learned something that would fuel her determination to be free. She discovered that her mother, Rit, should have been freed years earlier. According to the will of Rit's original owner, she and her children were supposed to be freed when Rit reached the age of 45. But the Broaddus family had simply ignored this provision in the will and kept Rit and her children enslaved. This revelation burned in Minty's heart. Even when the law, such as it was, said they should be free, even when a white man's own written wishes said they should be free, it meant nothing. Those in power simply ignored it when it suited them. The law was a tool of oppression, not protection. Justice for enslaved people was a cruel fiction. In 1844, when she was about 22 years old, Minty married a free black man named John Tubman. She took his last name and began calling herself Harriet, after her mother. It was one of the few choices she could make about her own identity, and she made it. But marriage to a free man did not make Harriet free. Under Maryland law, the status of enslaved or free was passed through the mother. Harriet's mother was enslaved, so Harriet was enslaved, regardless of whom she married. And if she had children, those children would be born into slavery, property from birth. This was one of slavery's many cruelties. It ensured that the enslaved population reproduced itself, that every generation born to enslaved mothers became new property to be exploited. The system was designed to perpetuate itself forever. John Tubman did not share Harriet's burning desire for freedom, or rather, he did not share her willingness to risk everything to achieve it. When Harriet began to speak seriously about escaping, about running north to freedom, John dismissed her dreams. He was comfortable with his free status, and he saw no reason to support Harriet in what he viewed as a suicidal plan. Some accounts say he even threatened to turn her in if she attempted to escape, though this is disputed. What is clear is that when Harriet made her decision to run, John would not join her. She was on her own. In 1849, Harriet learned devastating news. She and several of her siblings were about to be sold. Edward Broaddus had died, and his widow was settling the estate. Enslaved people were assets to be liquidated, property to be sold to the highest bidder to pay off debts. The family that Harriet had fought so hard to stay connected to was about to be torn apart forever. For Harriet, this was the final straw. She had two choices: submit to being sold, likely to a deep South plantation where she would be worked to death in the cotton or sugar fields, never to see her family again, or run. She chose to run. One night, she and two of her brothers slipped away from the plantation and headed north. But her brothers had not prepared themselves mentally for what escape required. Fear quickly overcame them. They worried about the slave catchers, about the dogs, about the terrible punishments that awaited runaways who were captured. They insisted on turning back.
Harriet argued with them, pleaded with them, but they were determined. And she made a decision that must have broken her heart. She went back with them. Not because she had changed her mind, but because traveling alone was even more dangerous, and she needed to regroup, to plan better. But that return to the plantation was temporary. Within days, Harriet set out again. This time, she went alone. She left behind her husband, who would not come with her. She left behind her family, her mother and father, her siblings, everyone she loved. She had no map, no detailed knowledge of the route ahead, and almost no resources. All she had was the North Star to guide her, an unshakable determination to be free, and the visions that told her she would make it.
Harriet Tubman walked nearly 90 miles through some of the most hostile territory in America. She traveled by night, sleeping hidden during the day in swamps, in forests, under haystacks, wherever she could avoid detection. She navigated by the stars, by the moss that grows on the north side of trees, by pure instinct. She followed routes established by the Underground Railroad, though she didn't always know where the next safe house would be. The Underground Railroad was a network of safe houses, secret routes, and brave people, both black and white, who risked everything to help enslaved people escape to freedom. Harriet relied on signals she had heard about: a lantern in a window, a quilt hanging in a particular pattern, coded messages that indicated safety. She was helped along the way by Quakers and other abolitionists who ran safe houses. These people, knowing they could be imprisoned or worse for helping fugitive slaves, opened their doors to Harriet and fed her, hid her, and pointed her to the next station on the Underground Railroad. After weeks of traveling, after close calls with slave catchers, and moments when discovery seemed certain, Harriet crossed the border into Pennsylvania. She crossed into free territory. Years later, she described that moment with words that still resonate. "I looked at my hands to see if I was the same person. There was such a glory over everything. The sun came like gold through the trees and over the fields, and I felt like I was in heaven." Harriet Tubman was free. At age 27, she had achieved what millions of enslaved people dreamed of, but few ever accomplished. She had escaped. She had risked everything and won. She could have stayed in Pennsylvania, built a new life, lived out her days in safety. That's what most escapees did. That's what any reasonable person would do. But Harriet Tubman was not most people, and her story was only beginning.
Freedom tasted sweet, but it was bittersweet. Harriet was free, but she was alone. Her family remained enslaved. Her people, millions of them, remained in chains. She had escaped, but escape was not victory if the people she loved were left behind. Most people who escaped slavery never looked back, and who could blame them? The risks were unimaginable. Slave catchers prowled the border states, hunting fugitives for profit. The Fugitive Slave Act, passed in 1850, made even northern states dangerous for escaped slaves. Under this law, any black person could be accused of being a fugitive slave, and they could be seized and returned to the South with almost no due process. Even in supposedly free states, freedom was precarious. Going back to the South, deliberately returning to slave territory with a price on your head was essentially suicide. It meant walking into the heart of danger, into a place where you were wanted, where slave catchers hunted you, where your former owners would do anything to recapture you. It meant risking not just re-enslavement, but death, because captured fugitives were often tortured as examples to discourage others from running. But Harriet Tubman decided she would go back. Not once, but again and again. For the next decade, she would make approximately 13 trips back into slave territory. Some historians believe the number was higher, risking her life each time to lead others to freedom. Her first rescue mission came in 1850, just a year after her own escape. She learned that her niece, Keziah Jolie, and Keziah's 2 young children were about to be sold at an auction in Cambridge, Maryland. The family would be separated, sold to different buyers, never to see each other again. Harriet coordinated with Keziah's husband, John Bowley, who was a free black man. Together, they devised a plan. During the chaos of the auction, John managed to hide Keziah and the children. That night, under cover of darkness, Harriet guided them north to freedom in Philadelphia. The rescue was successful. But when Harriet looked around at all the other enslaved people still trapped, still suffering, she knew she couldn't stop. She went back again, and again, and again. Over the next decade, Harriet Tubman made approximately 13 documented trips into slave territory. Each journey lasted weeks or sometimes months. Each trip required meticulous planning, incredible courage, and a willingness to face death. She traveled hundreds of miles on foot, through swamps and forests, across rivers and mountains, always moving by night, always one step ahead of those who hunted her. She developed methods and strategies that kept her and her passengers alive. She studied the patterns of slave catchers and learned how to avoid them. She memorized the routes, the safe houses, the people who could be trusted. She became a master of disguise and deception. She traveled in winter when the nights were longer and fewer people were outside to spot fugitives. She moved on Saturday nights because newspapers that printed runaway slave notices were published early in the week, giving them precious extra time before their escape was widely publicized. She used various disguises, sometimes dressing as a man to avoid detection, sometimes as an old woman hunched and hobbling, sometimes as someone of higher status who wouldn't be questioned.
Harriet carried a pistol, though not primarily as a weapon against slave catchers. The gun served a different purpose: to prevent her passengers from turning back. The Underground Railroad operated on absolute secrecy. If someone turned back, if they were captured and tortured until they revealed the routes and the safe houses, everyone in the network would be endangered. Dozens of people who risked their lives to help fugitives would be arrested or killed. So Harriet made it clear, once you started the journey with her, you finished it. You'll be free or die, she would tell anyone who faltered. She would point the pistol at anyone who wanted to give up and make them understand there was no going back. Freedom or death. Those were the only options. It wasn't a threat. It was the reality of their situation. And her passengers understood. No one turned back on Harriet Tubman's watch. No one. She used coded messages and songs to communicate with enslaved people planning to escape. Spirituals that sounded like simple religious songs were actually instructions and signals. Wade in the water wasn't just about baptism, it was an instruction to walk in streams to throw off the dogs tracking their scent. Swing low, sweet chariot signaled that the Underground Railroad was nearby and ready to help. When Harriet arrived in an area, word would spread quietly among the enslaved community. Moses was here. Moses was going north. Moses was taking passengers. Those who had prepared themselves, who had decided they would risk everything for freedom, would watch for her signals. She worked closely with a network of abolitionists, both black and white, who provided safe houses, food, clothing, and information. Thomas Garrett, a Quaker businessman in Wilmington, Delaware, personally helped Harriet rescue dozens of people. He kept detailed records, and he estimated that he aided nearly 3,000 fugitive slaves during his lifetime. He and Harriet worked together on many rescues. William Still, a free black man in Philadelphia, was the chairman of the Philadelphia Vigilance Committee, which aided fugitive slaves. He kept detailed records of the people who passed through the Underground Railroad, records that would later become invaluable historical documents. He worked closely with Harriet, providing resources and support for her missions. The Underground Railroad was not a literal railroad, of course, but a network of secret routes and safe houses that stretched from the Deep South all the way to Canada. Safe houses were often marked with subtle signals, a certain quilt pattern hanging on a line, a lantern placed in a specific window, a particular phrase spoken in greeting that indicated safety. After the Fugitive Slave Act of 1850 made even northern states dangerous, Harriet began taking her passengers all the way to Canada, adding hundreds of additional miles to an already grueling journey. Canada did not recognize American slavery law, so once fugitives crossed the border, they were truly free from recapture. Imagine the journey. Weeks of walking through wilderness, sleeping in the cold, eating whatever food could be scavenged or provided by safe houses, constantly alert for danger. Families traveling together tried to keep children quiet. A crying baby could give away their location. Injured or sick passages had to keep moving or be left behind. Every sound in the forest could be a slave catcher. Every stranger could be an informer. And through it all, Harriet led them. When passengers were exhausted and wanted to stop, she pushed them forward. When they were terrified and wanted to turn back, she reminded them why they had come. When they doubted they could make it, she told them about the freedom waiting at the end of the journey.
In 1851, Harriet made one of her most emotional rescue missions. She returned to Maryland to rescue her brother Moses and 2 other men. Then in 1857, she made perhaps her most daring and dangerous rescue. She went back to bring out her parents. Ben and Rit Ross were elderly by then, in their 70s. They were too old to walk the long distance to freedom, but Harriet was determined. She arranged for a horse and a makeshift wagon, and she guided her parents north in what must have been an agonizingly slow and dangerous journey. Every mile took longer because of her parents' age and frailty. But Harriet succeeded. She brought her elderly parents all the way to Canada, to freedom, to a place where they would never again fear being sold or separated. She also rescued several of her brothers and brought them north. But despite all her efforts, she was never able to rescue her husband, John Tubman. When she finally made it back to Maryland to bring him to freedom, she learned that he had remarried and had no interest in leaving. It must have broken her heart, but Harriet didn't let it stop her mission. She took other passengers north instead. Throughout these years, Harriet became legendary in the enslaved community and notorious among slave owners. Stories spread of this woman who appeared like a ghost, led people to freedom, and vanished before she could be caught. Enslaved people whispered her name with hope. Slave owners spoke it with fury and fear. Rewards for her capture climbed higher and higher. Some sources claim the total bounty reached $40,000, though exact figures are difficult to verify. What is certain is that she was one of the most wanted fugitives in the South. Wanted posters circulated with descriptions of her, though many of these descriptions were inaccurate, which worked in her favor. But despite the bounties, despite the slave catchers hunting her, despite the danger she walked into on every trip, they never caught her, not once. Harriet operated with an almost supernatural sense of danger. She seemed to know when patrols were near, when a safe house had been compromised, when to change routes or hide. Her passengers believed God protected her, that divine providence guided her steps. Harriet believed this too. She prayed constantly and said that God gave her warnings when danger was close. Whether it was divine intervention, heightened instincts developed from her sleeping disorder and years of experience, or simply extraordinary situational awareness, Harriet had an uncanny ability to evade capture. She seemed to sense danger before it appeared. She once boarded a train heading south when she knew slave catchers were looking for someone heading north. She hid in plain sight, reasoning that no one would expect a fugitive to travel toward slave territory. Another time, she spotted her former owner on a street and quickly released a cage of chicken she was carrying, then chased after them, playing the role of a flustered old woman. Her former owner walked right past her without recognition. Harriet's fame spread throughout the abolitionist community in the North. Frederick Douglass, himself an escaped slave and the most prominent black abolitionist in America, knew Harriet personally and praised her courage. He wrote to her once, I have had the applause of the crowd and the satisfaction that comes of being approved by the multitude, while the most that you have done has been witnessed by a few trembling, scarred, and footsore bondmen and women. The midnight sky and the silent stars have been the witnesses of your devotion to freedom and of your heroism.
When the first shots of the Civil War were fired at Fort Sumter in April 1861, the conflict was not initially about slavery. President Abraham Lincoln and the Union leadership framed it as a war to preserve the Union, to prevent the Southern states from seceding and breaking the nation apart. But everyone knew that slavery was the root cause, the fundamental issue driving the South's determination to leave. For Harriet Tubman and millions of enslaved people, the war's official purpose didn't matter. What mattered was that this conflict would determine their fate. If the Union won, slavery might end. If the Confederacy won and secured its independence, slavery would be entrenched forever. Harriet knew which side she was on, and she was determined to do more than just hope for victory. She would fight for it. In 1862, Harriet traveled to the Union-occupied areas of South Carolina. The Union Army had captured Port Royal and the surrounding Sea Islands early in the war, and thousands of enslaved people had fled from nearby plantations to seek refuge with the Union forces. These formerly enslaved people, called contrabands in the language of the time, as if they were captured property rather than liberated human beings, needed help adjusting to freedom. They needed food, shelter, medical care, and guidance. Harriet arrived not as a refugee, but as someone ready to serve. She worked as a nurse, tending to wounded and sick soldiers, both black and white, and caring for the formerly enslaved people in the contraband camps. She used her knowledge of herbal medicine, learned from her mother and other enslaved people during her years in Maryland, to treat dysentery and other diseases that ravaged the camps. Dysentery was particularly devastating. It killed more soldiers during the Civil War than combat did. Harriet made a remedy from water lilies and roots that proved effective where other treatments failed. She worked tirelessly in the hospital tents, often without adequate supplies, watching men die from wounds and disease and comforting them in their final moments. But Harriet's most valuable contribution to the Union war effort was not as a nurse, it was as a scout and intelligence agent. The Union Army was operating in unfamiliar Southern territory. They didn't know the landscape, the rivers, the back roads, the locations of Confederate troops and supplies. They needed intelligence, and they needed scouts who could gather that intelligence without being detected. Harriet knew this world. She had spent a decade navigating Southern territory undetected, moving through hostile areas, gathering information, and staying one step ahead of those hunting her. These skills, honed during her years on the Underground Railroad, now made her invaluable to the Union Army. She was recruited to lead scouting and intelligence missions into Confederate-held territory. This was extremely dangerous work. If she was captured, she would face not just death, but likely torture, as the Confederates would want to extract information about Union plans and movements. Harriet organized a network of scouts, recruiting formerly enslaved men who knew the local area, who could blend in, and who had every reason to help the Union defeat the Confederacy. These men ventured deep into Confederate territory, mapping out troop positions, identifying supply depots, and reporting back to Union commanders. The intelligence they provided was crucial. It helped Union forces plan their operations, avoid ambushes, and strike at vulnerable Confederate positions. Harriet's network was so effective that Confederate forces often didn't know how the Union had obtained such accurate information. Then, in June of 1863, Harriet Tubman did something that no other woman had done before in American military history. She helped plan and lead an armed military raid.
The Combahee River Raid was a strategic mission designed to destroy Confederate supply lines and liberate enslaved people in the Combahee River region of South Carolina. The operation was commanded by Colonel James Montgomery, a white officer who had worked with Harriet and respected her abilities. But the planning and reconnaissance for the raid came from Harriet and her network of scouts. For weeks before the raid, Harriet's scouts had mapped out the area.
They identified the locations of Confederate torpedoes, mines planted in the river to sink Union boats. They documented which plantations held the most enslaved people. They found the supply depots and noted the positions of Confederate pickets and patrols. On the night of June 2, 1863, 3 Union gunboats moved up the Combahee River under cover of darkness. Harriet Tubman was on the lead boat, guiding them through the dangerous waters. Her scouts had marked the locations of the Confederate mines, and the boats navigated around them successfully. As the boats moved upriver, Union soldiers came ashore at strategic points. They set fire to Confederate warehouses filled with supplies. They destroyed railroad bridges and infrastructure. They burned rice mills and other economic assets that supported the Confederate war effort. But this wasn't just a destructive raid. This was a liberation mission. Word spread quickly among the enslaved people on nearby plantations that Union boats were in the river. This was the moment many of them had been waiting for, praying for. Freedom was at hand. But they had to act quickly, had to reach the boats before Confederate forces arrived to stop them. Hundreds of enslaved people, perhaps as many as 700 or more, began running toward the river. They came from every direction: men, women, children, the elderly, the sick, everyone who could walk or be carried. They brought with them whatever they could grab: a few possessions, livestock, children. The scene was chaos. Joyful, terrifying, overwhelming chaos. People were screaming, crying, laughing, praying. Mothers held babies above their heads as they waded through water. Elderly people who had never expected to live to see freedom stumbled toward the boats with tears streaming down their faces. Children clung to their parents' clothing, wide-eyed and frightened but filled with hope. The Union soldiers and sailors worked frantically to get people on board. The boats were designed to carry perhaps 100 people each, and now hundreds were trying to board. There was a real danger that the boats would be overloaded and sink.
Harriet stood on the deck of one of the boats, and she began to sing. Her voice carried across the water, cutting through the chaos. Come along, don't be alarmed. Uncle Sam is rich enough to give you all a farm." It was a song of encouragement, of promise, of freedom, and it helped organize the chaos. People formed rough lines, helping each other board, passing children hand to hand to get them safely onto the boats. The operation was astonishingly successful. By the time the boats moved back downriver, over 700 enslaved people had been liberated in a single night. Imagine that. 700 people who had been property, who had been bought and sold, who had been told their entire lives they were less than human, now standing on Union boats as free people, heading toward a new life. Many of the men rescued in the Combahee River raid went on to join the Union Army, enlisting in the all-black regiments that fought in some of the war's most brutal battles. They fought to free their families, their people, to destroy the system that had enslaved them. The Combahee River raid was celebrated as a major Union victory. It destroyed significant Confederate supplies, disrupted their operations, and most importantly, liberated hundreds of people. Union military leadership praised the operation, but Harriet Tubman received almost no official recognition and certainly no adequate compensation. She was a black woman in an era when black women's contributions were barely acknowledged, even when those contributions were extraordinary. She continued to receive only the meager wages of a nurse, nothing more. Think about that. She planned and led a successful military operation that would have made any male officer famous and led to promotion and commendation. But she was paid as a nurse and given no official military rank, no pension, no recognition befitting her service. Harriet continued her work through the rest of the war, serving as a scout, nurse, and advisor. She worked in hospitals in Virginia and Florida. She continued to gather intelligence. She helped newly freed people adjust to freedom, teaching them skills, helping them find work, advocating for their needs. When the war finally ended in April 1865 with the Confederate surrender at Appomattox Courthouse, Harriet was 43 years old. She had lived her entire adult life fighting slavery. first by liberating individuals one by one through the Underground Railroad, then by serving in the war that ended it. The 13th Amendment to the Constitution, ratified in December 1865, officially abolished slavery throughout the United States. 4 million people were freed. The institution that had defined American life for 2.5 centuries was finally destroyed. Harriet had lived to see it. She had fought for it. She had risked her life for it countless times. And now it was real. Slavery was over. But for Harriet Tubman, the fight for justice was not finished. Liberation from slavery was just the beginning. Now came the harder work of building a free and just society, of ensuring that formerly enslaved people had opportunities, that they could vote, own property, be educated, live with dignity. And Harriet would spend the rest of her long life working toward that goal.
After the Civil War ended, Harriet Tubman returned to Auburn, New York, a town in the Finger Lakes region that had been sympathetic to the abolitionist cause. She had purchased a small piece of land there before the war, with financial help from supporters, and it would be her home for the remainder of her life. But if anyone expected Harriet to retire quietly after her decades of service, they didn't know her at all. She was in her 40s, which in that era was considered approaching old age, especially for someone who had endured as much physical hardship as Harriet. But she wasn't done, not even close. Her first battle was simply trying to get paid for her service during the war. Despite her years of work as a scout, spy, and nurse, despite the intelligence she provided and the military operations she led, Harriet received almost no compensation from the U.S. government. She was not officially recognized as a soldier or scout in military records, so she was not entitled to a military pension. The men she had worked alongside, whose missions she had guided, received pensions, but she did not. For years, Harriet and her supporters petitioned Congress for recognition and compensation. She submitted affidavits from military officers who had served with her, from people she had rescued, from anyone who could document her service. The process was humiliating and exhausting. She was forced to prove over and over that she had done what everyone knew she had done, to beg for the compensation she had rightfully earned. It took nearly 30 years before she was finally granted a pension. And even then, it wasn't for her own service. In 1869, Harriet had married Nelson Davis, a Union Army veteran much younger than herself. Nelson had been enslaved before the war, had served in the U.S. colored troops, and had chronic illness from his war service. When he died in 1888, Harriet applied for a widow's pension. She was eventually granted $8 a month as a veteran's widow. Years later, after continued lobbying, the pension was increased to $20 a month. To put that in perspective, male veterans with far less distinguished service received pensions many times larger. $20 a month for the woman who had freed dozens, who had served as a spy and military leader, who had risked her life repeatedly for her country. It was an insult dressed up as compensation. But financial struggles did not stop Harriet from continuing her work. In fact, her home in Auburn became a refuge for people in need. She took in elderly, formerly enslaved people who had nowhere else to go. She sheltered orphans and homeless individuals. She fed hungry families. Often she did this at her own expense, even though she could barely afford it. Harriet's home was always open. People knew that if they needed help, if they had nowhere to turn, they could go to Harriet Tubman's house, and she would not turn them away. She lived the principles she had fought for, the belief that every human being deserved dignity, care, and respect. In 1896, despite her own financial struggles, Harriet purchased 25 acres of land adjacent to her property. Her dream was ambitious and beautiful. She wanted to build a home for aged and indigent Black people, a place where those who had been denied dignity their entire lives could live out their years with comfort and respect.
She didn't have the money to build it alone. So she approached the African Methodist Episcopal Zion Church and worked with them to establish the Harriet Tubman Home for the Aged. It took years of fundraising, of organizing, of convincing people to support her vision. But in 1908, the home officially opened its doors. Harriet attended the dedication ceremony. She was in her 80s by then, her body worn down by decades of hardship, still suffering from the sleeping spells caused by her childhood injury, still enduring headaches and pain. But she stood there and watched her dream become reality. The irony is painful to contemplate. Years later, when Harriet herself became too ill and frail to live independently, she was admitted to the home she had founded. She had to pay a fee to live there. The woman who had given everything had to pay to stay in the institution she had created. But Harriet's work in her later years wasn't limited to caring for the poor and elderly. She also became involved in the women's suffrage movement, the fight to secure voting rights for women. This may seem like a departure from her earlier work, but it wasn't. To Harriet, it was all part of the same struggle. She had fought for physical freedom from slavery. Now she fought for political freedom, the right to vote, to have a voice in the government, to participate fully in democracy. Harriet spoke at suffrage conventions alongside prominent leaders like Susan B. Anthony and Emily Howland. Her presence was powerful and symbolic. Here was a woman who had risked her life for freedom, who had led armed raids, who had changed the course of American history. And yet, she still couldn't vote. She was still denied the basic right to participate in her country's governance. Harriet's speeches at these conventions were characteristically direct. She didn't have the formal education of many other suffragettes, didn't use elaborate rhetoric or philosophical arguments. She spoke from experience, from the heart, with a moral authority that needed no embellishment. She talked about the double burden of being black and female in America, about how black women faced both racial oppression and gender discrimination. She spoke about how men, black and white, had fought in wars, had made great sacrifices, but women had too, and they deserved recognition and rights. One of her most frequently quoted statements from this period was simple and devastating. I was a conductor on the Underground Railroad for 8 years, and I can say what most conductors can't say. I never ran my train off the track, and I never lost a passenger. But even after all that, I can't vote. That's not right. She was absolutely correct. It wasn't right. And though Harriet would not live to see the 19th Amendment passed in 1920, granting women the vote, her voice added to the chorus demanding change. Throughout her later years, Harriet also continued to tell her story, though she never profited from it the way she should have. In 1869, Sarah Bradford, a white teacher and writer, published a biography of Harriet titled Scenes in the Life of Harriet Tubman. The book helped spread awareness of Harriet's accomplishments to a wider audience. Bradford revised and expanded the book in 1886 under the title Harriet, the Moses of Her People. These books were important in preserving Harriet's story and introducing her to people who might not otherwise have known about her. But most of the profits from the books went to pay off Harriet's debts and support her charitable work. Harriet herself saw little financial benefit.
As Harriet aged, her health continued to decline. The sleeping spells that had plagued her since childhood continued, sometimes striking without warning, even in her 80s. She suffered from severe and constant headaches, likely related to her old head injury. The physical toll of decades of hardship, sleeping in swamps, walking hundreds of miles, enduring cold and hunger, had accumulated in her body. In 1898, when she was in her mid-70s, Harriet underwent brain surgery at Massachusetts General Hospital in Boston. The surgery was an attempt to alleviate some of the symptoms from her traumatic brain injury sustained so many decades earlier. This was the era before modern anesthesia was widely used, especially for black patients. Harriet refused chloroform or ether. Instead, she chose to undergo the surgery the way she had seen soldiers endure amputations during the Civil War. She bit down on a bullet and endured the pain. The doctors operated on her skull while she was conscious, or at best in a twilight state. The agony must have been unimaginable. But Harriet bore it without complaint, just as she had borne so much else in her life. The surgery provided some relief from her symptoms, but not complete relief. The sleeping spells continued. The headaches persisted, though perhaps less severely. Harriet lived with chronic pain for the rest of her life, but she never let it stop her from her work. She remained active in her community well into her 80s. She attended services at the AME Zion Church in Auburn regularly. She continued to speak at local events about her experiences. She maintained her work with the Home for the Aged, and she kept her door open to anyone who needed help. In early March of 1913, Harriet Tubman became seriously ill. She was approximately 91 years old, though, as always, her exact age remained uncertain. She developed pneumonia, and it was clear that her body, which had endured so much for so long, was finally failing. She was moved to the Harriet Tubman Home for the Aged, the institution she had founded, to spend her final days surrounded by the community she had served and loved. Friends, family, and community members gathered around her bed. They sang spirituals, the same songs that had once guided enslaved people to freedom. They prayed. They reminisced about Harriet's incredible life. On March 10, 1913, Harriet Tubman passed away. Her last words were reported to be, "I go to prepare a place for you." It was a reference to John 14:2, Jesus' promise to his disciples that he would prepare a place for them in heaven. For Harriet, who had spent her life preparing places for others, safe houses on the Underground Railroad, refuge in her home, a residence for the elderly, it was a fitting final statement. Harriet Tubman was buried with military honors at Fort Hill Cemetery in Auburn, New York. Members of the local veterans organizations participated in her funeral. Firing a salute over her grave, the community, both black and white, came together to honor her. But even in death, Harriet did not receive the full recognition she deserved. The military honors were a gesture, but they didn't change the fact that she had never been properly compensated for her service, had never received the medals or commendations that male officers with far less distinguished records received routinely. For decades after her death, Harriet's story was known primarily within black communities and among historians of the abolitionist movement and the Civil War. Mainstream American history often glossed over her contributions or reduced them to a footnote in textbooks. But the truth has a way of persisting. Harriet's story was too powerful, her accomplishments too extraordinary, her courage too inspiring to remain buried.
In the years following Harriet Tubman's death, her story slowly began to receive the recognition it had always deserved. It started in black communities, where her memory was preserved and celebrated, where parents told their children about the woman called Moses, where her example inspired new generations fighting for justice. During the civil rights movement of the 1950s and 1960s, Harriet Tubman became an even more prominent symbol of resistance and courage. Activists fighting against segregation, fighting for voting rights, risking their lives to demand equality, looked back to Harriet as an example of what was possible when people refused to accept injustice. Rosa Parks, who sparked the Montgomery bus boycott by refusing to give up her seat, knew Harriet's story. Martin Luther King Jr. invoked the Underground Railroad as a metaphor for the journey toward justice. The courage that Harriet demonstrated, the willingness to risk everything, to go back into danger repeatedly, to never give up, became a touchstone for a new generation of freedom fighters. Schools and libraries, museums and community centers were named in Harriet's honor. Her childhood home area in Maryland was preserved. Her home in Auburn, New York, where she lived for so many years, was designated a National Historic Landmark. In 1978, the U.S. Postal Service issued a stamp featuring Harriet Tubman, the first black woman to be honored in the regular postage stamp series. It was a small but significant recognition. In 1995, Harriet was inducted into the National Women's Hall of Fame. In 2003, the Harriet Tubman Underground Railroad National Monument was established in Maryland, protecting the landscape where she had been enslaved and from which she had escaped. In 2016, the U.S. Treasury Department made a historic announcement. Harriet Tubman would be featured on the $20 bill, replacing President Andrew Jackson. The decision was groundbreaking. If implemented, it would make Harriet the first African American to be featured on U.S. paper currency and the first woman to appear on American paper money in over a century. The symbolism was profound. Jackson, the man currently on the $20 bill, was a slave owner who orchestrated the forced removal of Native Americans in the Trail of Tears. Replacing him with Harriet, a woman who had been enslaved and who fought her entire life against slavery and injustice, would represent a symbolic reckoning with America's history. The redesign has faced delays due to technical concerns and political opposition, but the intention to honor Harriet in this way has been reaffirmed. When it finally happens, every time someone handles a $20 bill, they will be reminded of Harriet Tubman's courage and sacrifice. In 2019, a major motion picture titled Harriet brought her story to mainstream audiences worldwide. The film, starring Cynthia Erivo, introduced Harriet's life to millions of people who might not have known her story. While no film can fully capture the complexity and scope of a life as extraordinary as Harriet's, it sparked renewed interest in her legacy. Books, documentaries, children's literature, academic studies. Harriet's story has been told and retold, each telling adding new details, new perspectives, new appreciation for what she accomplished. But beyond monuments and movies, beyond stamps and currency, Harriet Tubman's true legacy lives in the principles she embodied and the example she set.
She proved that one person, no matter how powerless the world says they are, can change history. She was born into slavery, the lowest position in American society, denied every right and every dignity. She was injured as a child, left with a disability that slave owners saw as making her defective and worthless. She was denied education, denied freedom, denied the most basic human rights, and she rose above all of it to become one of the most important figures in American history. She didn't have wealth. She didn't have political power. She didn't have armies or institutions backing her. What she had was courage, faith, intelligence, and an absolute refusal to accept that the world as it was the world as it had to be. She personally freed approximately 70 people through her Underground Railroad missions. But the ripple effects of her actions are immeasurable. The children who were born free because their parents escaped with Harriet. The descendants who grew up with opportunities their ancestors never had. The courage she inspired in others to resist, to fight, to believe that change was possible. The intelligence she provided during the Civil War that helped the Union achieve victory. The example she set that inspired generations of activists fighting for justice. Harriet Tubman's legacy is in every person who refuses to accept injustice, in every person who risks something to help others, in every person who goes back into danger to bring others to safety, in every person who believes that one person can make a difference. She once said, "Every great dream begins with a dreamer. Always remember, you have within you the strength, the patience, and the passion to reach for the stars, to change the world." Harriet didn't just dream of a different world. She built it, one rescue at a time, one act of courage at a time, one refusal to give up at a time. If Harriet's story has moved you, if you believe these legacies must be preserved and shared, help us share Harriet's story by subscribing to our channel. Your subscription ensures that voices like Harriet's continue to inspire. Click subscribe now and join us in keeping these essential stories alive. Another of her most famous quotes captures the essence of her philosophy. "I had reasoned this out in my mind. There was one of two things I had a right to: liberty or death. If I could not have one, I would have the other." Liberty or death, freedom or nothing. She wasn't willing to compromise, wasn't willing to accept half measures, wasn't willing to live as property when she could die as a free woman. She chose liberty, and then she chose to share that liberty with others, no matter the cost.